I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Jessica Lautz from the National Association of Realtors. Dr. Lautz is the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights and is part of NAR's research team. She will be presenting some data regarding generational trends, student loan debt, and a profile of buyers. Welcome, Dr. Lautz.
Thank you so much. Good morning. So I'm joining you from Arlington, Virginia right now. I am just outside of DC where it is pouring down rain here today. So I hope you guys have better weather wherever you are. I see virtual folks, and I know that folks are in person as well, which is really exciting that we can do this all. And I think at the end of the day, have more people joining. So where in the world is the housing market today? We really are in a very, very unique time. So traditionally in the fall, we know that kids are back to school. This isn't necessarily a time where people say, hey, I'm going to move right during the holidays. All of that being said, we are seeing some movement and the housing market is actually moving pretty quick. All of that said, it seems to be pretty hit or miss. We know that CEOs are saying to many people right now, either you are permanently remote and you don't have to go back to work at all, or you're in some sort of hybrid situation, but maybe you'll have to come back at the end of the year, or you don't, or you need to be in the office and maybe you already are. And so all of that, I think, is changing a lot of consumer behavior as well, as we know that a lot of people are saying, let me move to a different area of the country. Let me move to a more affordable area locally and just have more space as well. And so we're seeing a lot of this movement is really being dictated by CEOs having this plan of action here. So what in the world is the housing landscape? I'm going to preface this with all of what I'm going to give you is national statistics with the exception of a couple of factors here. A couple of maps that I will show you. And when we're looking at this data, I will say that you're the local expert. You know your market, you know your niche way more than I ever would have any ability to learn that. And so I do say that these are national data points and not necessarily what you personally are seeing in your local neighborhood. I will say this though, interest rates seem to be ticking upwards. We know that they just increased to about 3.1%. We have a lot of strong demand and it's driven by investors, it's driven by vacation home buyers, and it's driven by primary residence buyers who are taking advantage of these low interest rates. When we look to 2022, which is very quick on the horizon here, what we do expect is that interest rates are going to tick up. Our forecast from our chief economist, Dr. Laurence Yun, was just revised yesterday, and he expects by 2022, we're going to be looking at about 3.5%. Still incredibly, incredibly low. But with that slight tick up in interest rates, what could happen is you could actually see a rush of buyers coming in and saying, wow, I need to take advantage of these low interest rates right now, lock this in, because if I'm looking at 3.5, that is a difference in the amount of buying power that I have. It could also mean that people who are on the fringes, people who are having a hard time entering home ownership in the first place may say, I can't actually get there today. We also know that we have very low housing inventory on a national scale. We're just looking at a little above 1 million units for sale. When we think back to the 1980s, as long as we've been collecting that data point, we know that this is towards historic lows. We have 2.4 months of supply on a national scale. That being said, that's kind of a lie because it includes pending contracts. And once a home is pending, we know it's really just not available inventory for buyers out there today. And homes are moving fast because of this low inventory. They are moving 17 days on market. It's not as fast as what we had seen perhaps in some of the summer months where it had been as low as 14 days on market. So really, really a quick pace last spring as well. We're not seeing that kind of activity, but 17 days is very, very low if we think about this historically. We also know that home prices, because of this lack of inventory, the low interest rates, the buyer demand that's out there today, it is pushing up home prices. On a national scale, we're looking at 13% increase year over year. Again, double-digit pace historically means very fast. That being said, when we had seen those crazy price escalations, we were looking at about 20% year-over-year increase. So it's down from that, but that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. That means that more buyers may actually be looking at this market and saying, okay, now I can get in. We've had that frenzy activity last summer through this spring, and now I think I can actually enter into this market, even though prices have risen. We also know this is a nationwide phenomenon, and I think this is where it becomes very interesting. 99% of the markets that we track, we've had year-over-year home price growth, but we also know in 94% of the markets we're tracking, it's actually double-digit year-over-year home price growth. So really incredible gains on a nationwide scale. The other thing that we know is that it's 114 months. It's a very long period of time. It's the longest period of time where we've recorded back to the 1960s where we've had year-over-year home price growth. So that really does speak to the strength of the market, but also the lack of affordability for first-time home buyers. The other thing that we're seeing here is who in the world can get into this market. We know that a lot of this is driven by all cash buyers. It's driven by buyers who have strong conventional financing contracts that they're putting in. A quarter of the market is paying all cash. That's pretty extraordinary. When we look back just a year ago, when we had that frenzy of a market, we know that it was about 15% of the market who was paying all cash. So this is even elevated from that frenzy activity. We also know that there's a section of the market who continues to buy sight unseen. This is incredible to me, honestly. I'm hearing this anecdotally from realtors. I'm hearing the angst in their voice when they say, oh my goodness, the buyer has not even seen this until they're going to the closing table. I hope they like it because I helped them pick out this home. I FaceTimed this home with them. I told them what it was like inside, but I'm not the buyer. And so they're really going to the closing table with a lot of angst saying, I hope this works out. And it seems to be working out, but that does put a lot of pressure on realtors out there to say, what does this home actually sound like? What is this neighborhood actually? Can you actually tell me how it smells? Are there cats in the home? What is this home that I can't see through technology? And you're describing that to me. That's knowing that buyer on a very personal level to really understand what they're going to like and not like. We also know about a quarter of the market still waiving appraisals, still waiving home inspections. Maybe they're bringing a home inspector in before they place that contract to the home. But when we look at the actual pending contracts, we know that they're waiving those. So that becomes a very, very interesting proposition as well. So let's talk about some of the migration trends that we're seeing here. I do think this is very interesting. This takes USPS data and looks at some of the changes that we've seen. That being said, because it's USPS change of address data, it could be renters, it could be owners, it could be someone living in a long-term rental like an Airbnb, but they want to get their mail. So when we look at these trends, what we can see here, there's a lot of East Coast activity. So we can see that these massive migration trends, the first half of the year, we can see Massachusetts, Maine, the Carolinas, very, very popular place to go the first half of the year. Some places in Tennessee, Idaho, definitely a darling right now when we look at the media reports, and you can see that activity. What gets really interesting though is when we break this down by families. What we can see is that the first half of the year, there was a lot of migration flow towards Florida. So I think perhaps families said, you know what, school's all online, let's take my family to Florida. And so you saw that migration flow there. Also, the Carolinas, very popular, but we know that the Northeast, very popular as well. If we look at Cape Cod, great place to go. And then people just stayed. So perhaps buying vacation homes or being in long-term rentals. What becomes even more interesting is the economists who did this actually broke this down by individuals as well. And when we look at individuals the first half of the year, we had heard a lot about this migration out of the Bay Area, out of New York City. Sure, absolutely. There were some people who said, let me buy a second property outside of these areas or let me move. That absolutely happened. That being said, for individuals, the popular places in the country still remain popular in the first half of the year, even during the pandemic. So San Francisco, Denver, Seattle, San Jose, Portland, Oregon, all of those tech hubs that people always say they're too expensive. People are moving to Boise, Idaho. They're moving out of this area. We actually still saw migration from individuals into those areas. So there could have been some people who said, I'm priced out. Now I can finally move there. And so that I think becomes a very interesting population. Essentially, there's a lid for every pot that's out there right now. It may take a while for some of those properties to be sold, but it does seem like regardless of whether it's a family or an individual, folks have that demand for properties right now and that willingness to pay more than they would have last year, but they're still willing to get in. All right, so I do want to talk about some of these generational trends that we're seeing here. I think it's incredibly important for the business. We've heard about it incessantly when we talk about millennials, but there's a reason why. So let me show you some of this data. When we look at the population by age, what we see here is that this is a big chart and it's a messy chart. So what we're looking at here is the millions of people in this country, regardless of age, in this country. And so what we're looking at here on the green bar, these are people who are less than 1 year old, new babies who were just born this year, pandemic babies, all the way up to the gray. And we're looking at centenarians, we're looking at people over the 100, but you can see this number does kind of trail off with mortality rates. All right, so the big wedge here, the light blue, that is the millennial generation. This is the generation who's talked about incessantly, and there's a reason why. They are wider. It is the biggest span of a generation that we have today. It is also taller, meaning there's more millions of adults in this age range than any other age range in this country, meaning that's a lot of buying power and that's a lot of dictating trends and what people want out of a home and so on, and not just home ownership, many other things as well. This is why we hear a lot about them. So when we're looking at this millennial age generation here, what I want to show you and what I think becomes very important when we think about housing is the red bar. The red bar there is the median age of a first-time home buyer. That's 33 years old. It's been the same for a couple of years now. It's been very consistent. When we look behind this all the way back to 1981, the median age of a first-time home buyer ranges between 28 and 32. When we look at this chart, what we can see is that the tallest bars on this entire chart range between 28 and 32. We are seeing a wave of young adults who are aging into the most common first-time homebuyer age. They are coming, they're there, they're your clients. They are the biggest generation of homebuyers today at 37%, but there is more coming and there's more behind them. And we're really going to be seeing them entering into homeownership. All of that said, the first-time homebuyer share, when we look at this by a share, is under where it has been as a historical norm. We see it today at a 33-year low at just 31%. And this becomes important because millennials have a lot of headwinds. First-time homebuyers, young millennials have a lot of headwinds entering homeownership. That affordability, lack of inventory, they're really against a lot of competition from investors and vacation buyers to be able to enter into homeownership. The last time we saw first-time homebuyers this low was in the 1980s when we had double-digit interest rates. So a very, very different environment than what we have today. And so we know that there's another headwind there. And that other headwind is student loan debt. And I do want to talk a little about that. We've done some recent research on this, and I think it's really important when we talk about generational trends and we talk about the wave of millennial buyers who are coming in, they're probably wealthy. They're probably higher income. They probably have mom and dad's help, either moving from mom and dad's house or with mom and dad's help with down payment. So let's look at those young adults who are student loan borrowers who may not have that help. The first thing I want to show you is that student loan debt did get an edge during the pandemic. One of the very, very first stimulus packages actually allowed student loan debt to go to a 0% interest rate for federal student loans. What we found is that 38% of student loan debt borrowers actually did get ahead on their student loan debt and were able to pay down their student loan debt during the pandemic, either through that 0% interest loan or because they cut spending everywhere else in their life. They had nothing to do during the very first months of the pandemic. There was really not much to do. So they really tackled onto their debt. The other thing is that they may have moved. They moved in with their family members, they moved to a low cost area, and that got them ahead as well. And so that's a very interesting change. The next thing that's very, very important when we talk about housing and student loan debt is the ability to move out of your parents' house. So the next chart I'm going to show you looks at headship rates, the ability to move out of your family member's house after graduation from college. So the headship rate of young adults. And what we see here is a couple of things. One, Gen Zers, after they graduated, Gen Zers are below the age of 21. So after they graduated, and they just graduated, if they did, They just moved home with their family members. That's probably not a surprise. The vast majority of them did. It's not a surprise because they're moving home during a pandemic, not really probably want to go into a city center or somewhere else. That's not shocking to me. What is surprising to me when we look at this chart is the difference between millennials and Gen Xers. So Gen Xers, 37% of them were delayed, but the vast majority, they moved out after college. They went and lived in the Reality Bites world and Singles and all those cool movies, and they were able to be a young adult after college. What we see for millennials is 62% of them were delayed moving out of their family members' home. And this rises considerably when we look at Hispanic and minority borrowers as well. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. We've done some research on that, but we know that they have a higher student loan debt balance and a lower income after graduation, and that's going to feed into that. The other thing that's very important to look at here is the delay in purchasing a home. And that's what becomes, I think, very important to realtors, is to really understand the impact that student loan debt is having. And what we see here is that for about half of non-owners, they're saying that their student loan debt is delaying them from purchasing a home. They can't save for a down payment, their debt to income ratio is completely out of whack, and they really cannot borrow for a home. What we see is that for millennials, it rises to 60%. And for those who are making six figures, over $100,000, it also rises to 60%. So even though they're high income borrowers, they're still having a hard time really tackling on this debt. And maybe they have more of it, maybe they have professional degrees, and this is really being a struggle in them tackling their debt and being able to save for a down payment. I focused a lot on millennials here when we talk about student loan debt. And I do that for a reason, because they have a higher aggregate balance, just more student loan debt, and they're more likely to have taken on student loan debt. They're more educated, most educated generation from every other before them. And so they do have a lot of it. All of that said, I do want to back up and just say, when we talk about student loan debt, it is an all generation issue. It absolutely affects everyone. And the reason why I say that is for those who are over the age of 60 years old, their student loan debt has actually increased 1,900% since 2004. A lot of people went back to college after the Great Recession. A lot of people took on an additional degree, and a lot of people tried to cover their kids' college costs through Parent Plus loans. And so this does impact people being able to move from their current residence to be able to sell, but it does impact people entering homeownership as well. All right. Let's talk a little about the uneven recovery. I'm going to go into race. I think it's incredibly important to talk about this. We know now, looking at the homeownership rate by race today, it is as wide as when the Fair Housing Act started in 1968. So we really do see an incredibly wide spread. But I want to show you some of the data on a state level and then show you the experience of recent homebuyers who entered. So when we look at this, what we can see is that there is a very big variation here, but this is the homeownership rate by race for white individuals. I'm going to pick on North Dakota right now in this presentation. I'm doing that on purpose. North Dakota, the homeownership rate for white individuals is 66%. In comparison, the homeownership rate for Black individuals is 5%. So this is pretty astronomically different. It varies considerably state to state. Affordability plays a key role here, but there are also just systemic issues that play key roles here as well. I want to look at the recent experience of a Black homebuyer compared to a white homebuyer, and their experience is completely different. For Black homebuyers, they are more likely to have student loan debt, double the share. They are also more likely to be a single income household and more likely to be a single female. We also know that that's going to feed into their ability to compete with these all cash buyers and their ability just to enter homeownership. The other thing that we see here is that they are more likely to be denied for a mortgage. They actually have a denial rate of 2.5 times successful homebuyers, 2.5 times what it is for white homebuyers. And that's really discouraging because we know that these are successful homebuyers who, in fact, there may be a lot of people who may have qualified for a loan and just walked away from the product, the intent of buying altogether, and may have gone back to renting they may have gone back to their family member's home and just said, I can't do this. I'm not going to qualify. And so I think that becomes incredibly disturbing when we look at this process. The reason why I'm bringing this all up, and the reason why it matters to millennials and it matters to different races, is that homeownership really is the number one way that we build wealth in our homes. And we can see here that for white families, they have $188,000 in net worth compared to Black African-American families who just have $24,000 in net worth. And that gap has continued to widen over time as we know that homeowners are gaining so much equity in their home and really building into their net worth and their family wealth. Well, we know that non-homeowners are not. And when we back this up and we look at all races, what we see here is that for owners versus renters, the net worth gap is actually 37 times for all races, for all generations. And that's, I think, just incredibly important when we look at this data. So I want to talk about some of the changes that are happening. I went really deep there into some really depressing data on millennials and on race, and I promise you I'm going to bring it back up and we're going to end on a good note. So let me take it home on a good note. We are seeing some big changes here on generations. I talked about millennials as the largest generations of home buyers today because they're the largest generation. We also know that boomers, they're the largest generation of sellers. They're holding on to a lot of net worth, a lot of family wealth. They're not downsizing. They don't need to. And they don't necessarily want to because they want family to come to their homes. Gen Xers, this is a very fascinating generation. They're both buying and they're selling, but they're not the biggest of each because they're just not the biggest generation. What we see for them, though, is incredibly interesting. They're high-income borrowers. They are buying the most expensive homes. They likely have kids under the age of 18 in their homes, and they likely also are the most likely generation to be buying a multi-generational home because they're taking care of aging parents, they're taking care of kids over the age of 18 who have now boomerang back to all those Gen Zers, and they're in that family member's home now. So we are seeing that there's a lot of pressures placed on Gen Xers right now. They're also the most likely generation to have purchased during the boom years, to have lost their home and now come back to homeownership. So very interesting generation to watch. When we talk about multi-generational homes, I think this is an interesting trend to watch, one that's probably sticky, is that we see there is a growth in multi-generational buyers. So people who are taking care of aging parents and kids over the age of 18. And we see that the number one reason to purchase a multi-generational home during the pandemic, which really ramped up, was for aging parents. So they didn't want their parents in assisted living or in a senior center, and so they brought them into their homes. This is a very interesting trend, something definitely to pay attention to. The housing stock in America is very old, and it doesn't necessarily support elderly relatives who may need widened doorways or widened hallways for walkers, or just making sure that everyone is safe in a bathroom and a kitchen. Those types of safety precautions just generally are not in our homes. We do know that the other reason for multi-generational buying was really just for pooling funds, for people saying, you know what, if I pooled my funds with someone else, with another nuclear family unit, I could actually buy a bigger home, a nicer home in a different neighborhood. And so we are seeing that that has increased as well during the pandemic. The other big demographic change that we are seeing is a massive, massive drop in birth rates in this country. It is now at a 100-year low, the lowest birth rates we've seen in a century, and that's the length of time that we have the data set. We do know that this is influencing home buying as well, because having a kid, having an extra baby in your house is generally an impetus to buy. It's also an impetus to buy if that kid leaves a nest and now you're an empty nester and you want to downsize. So that's a shift. We are seeing, though, among home buyers, we're just seeing a drop in home buyers who have kids in their home. That's just what we're seeing. So back in 1985, 58% of home buyers had a kid under the age of 18. Today, it's just 33%. So really seeing a pretty big shift here in people who have kids. That's going to change a bunch of things. One, it's going to change the size of the home that's needed, distance to the school district. Do you need a good school district? You have no intention of having kids or don't have them. It's also going to change buying power. If you don't have a kid, you certainly can buy a more expensive home than if you did have a kid under the age of 18 in your home, because that's pretty expensive. Whether that kid is in daycare or just in high school, regardless, it's a lot of money that you're shelling out every month for that kid. So you do see a difference there in buying power. The other massive demographic shift that we're seeing here is a drop in marriage rates. Marriage rates have continued to drop, have dropped during the pandemic and accelerated as well. And this is mirrored when we look at home buyers. So if we look at first-time home buyers especially, you really can see this trend happening where in 1980s, we saw that 75% of first-time home buyers were married, and today just half of first-time home buyers are married. And that really does mirror that trend. And when we look at where the growth is on the flip side, what we see are more singles who are buying homes together, but then we also see roommates who are buying homes together and unmarried couples. So a really big shift here towards single buyers, unmarried couples, and roommates. And I think this becomes very interesting. Unmarried couples and roommates, what happens if that relationship devolves? What happens if someone gets a job on the other side of the country, especially among those roommates? Single buyers, affordability. That's the big question. Can that single female buyer be able to afford a house by her own as she's competing with these married wealthy buyers, but also just as she watches home prices ramp up? So big questions there on both of those things. All right, so how in the world does agent use follow into all of this? Those are some big changes that I'm seeing happening in the data that are continuing to happen in the data. And the marketplace has definitely been fun, I think, in the last couple of years as we've watched buyers really jump in, that demand heat up. So what's the agent relationship? What we're seeing here is buyer use of agents as near all-time highs. It's at 88% right now. We don't see that people want to buy directly from that past owner. They want agent representation. They want help in negotiation, finding that perfect home for them, making sure that they can help them through every step of that home buying process. But we also know that for the youngest buyers who are out there, they're the most likely to use an agent. They want agent representation. They've had parent help a lot of their life, and they really do need that agent help to really help them navigate that process. The other thing that we're seeing is that on the seller side, 89% of sellers use an agent in the process. They absolutely want an agent. We ask what type of agent is being used. So is that someone who just lists on the MLS, does ad hoc services, or gives a broad range of every service that's out there, really before that home is ever listed, telling them how to fix up their home from sale all the way past the closing table. And what we see is that people are using agents that give that broad range of services at the highest share in the last decade. So people really do want a full service agent today. There's a lot of anxiety right now, and people just need that agent to really help them. What we also collect data on is iBuyers. We see iBuyers are at less than 1%, and FSBOs are near all-time lows at 8% this year. So people really not feeling comfortable doing it themselves. They really do want representation. And the top things they want from their seller's agent: sell in that specific time frame. They may have been in their home for longer than they expected to be, 10 years at an all-time high of 10 years before they're selling. They really want to find a qualified buyer, price that home competitively, market that home, but also right now they understand the importance of staging and making that home look nice, especially as everyone's using technology a lot. So they get it, and they really want that seller's agent to say, either you need to fix this or you don't, but also you need to make your home look nice. And they get that, and they do seem to understand that right now. So where I want to leave us on, the last topic that I want to talk about here is really labor force participation. What we have seen in the pandemic is that the labor force participation for women, just the last almost 2 years for women, has been very, very rough when we look at jobs. Women dropped out of the workforce at really a pace that we had not seen since 1984. They left jobs and said, I have caregiving responsibilities. I can't work in this job. I'm not making ends meet. School is online, and there's just no way that I can do this. And they really did leave the workforce. And they have come back, not to the state that we saw pre-pandemic, but they're trying to come back into the workforce. And some of this has to do with the sectors that women are working in as well. So we saw more jobs were really lost in service sectors. Even the receptionist at your dentist office, those hours are cut more than others. And so we saw women leave the workforce and say, I can't make ends meet here, and I really do have other responsibilities that I need to be taking care of. So childcare, elder care, and it really did fall on the shoulders of women. So that's a bad note. What I'm going to leave you on, though, is a good note. And what we are seeing when we look at real estate is completely the opposite. Women entered real estate, and we've surveyed on this year. Why do you enter real estate? And it's to be your own boss. It's to be your own entrepreneur, make your own money, and really do this on your own terms. And we have seen that women have decided real estate is the place to be for them. And when we look at our data, what we see is going back to 1978. When we look at brokers, only 21% were brokers back in 1978, and today 61% are brokers, 61%. So really a massive rise in women who are saying, I'm going to be my own boss, and I'm going to set my own hours, and I'm going to do this. And this has been very, very impressive to see in the data. When we look back in 1978, only 52% of full-time agents were women, and today it's 65%. So really seeing a growth in women who are saying, this is a place to be, this is my refuge, and joining real estate. So that's the good note I'm going to leave you on. I can't see the room, so I'm hoping that the majority are women, but I'm guessing they are knowing real estate. But even if it's not, I know that men enter to be their own boss too, and are really killing it in real estate as well. So thank you all. Please do follow us on social. And I think I have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any as well.